Professor Brandon Brown, very welcome to Fritanke's podcast.
Happy to be here. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be working with you.
Yeah, we're really happy to publish your book in Sweden about Max Planck. The English title is Max Planck, Driven by Vision, Broken by War. And when I read this book and we decided to publish it, I was so fascinated by the quite dramatic life that Max Planck had lived. I didn't know about that. I knew about his physics a little bit, but I didn't know about the quite tragic dramas in his life as well. Um, what was the reason you? I mean, how did you get the idea to write this biography about him?
Interesting question. It stems to my time as a student.
Okay.
Um, I was a sophomore in college, of all things, and we had the standard photo
Yeah.
of Professor Plunk in the side column of some textbook, and he looked so incredibly sad to me.
Hmm.
And a little older compared to everything else in the quantum physics story seemed like people in their 20s. And here was someone who made his big discovery in middle age. And I had a great professor who mentioned as a little side comment, a little tangent, that Planck had been confused by the meaning of his work for at least a decade. I was terribly
Hmm.
confused by stumbling onto this quantum reality and
Yeah.
what it really meant. And I was fascinated then at age 20 and started keeping a little folder. I never thought I would write a book, but I had an opportunity after finishing a set of other experiments in biophysics and took a sabbatical and really dedicated myself to trying to learn more about him.
Hmm. I see. And you are a professor of physics and astronomy, right?
Yes. Now, to be clear, that is my department's name.
Okay.
And I know very little about astrophysics. I'm more
Hmm.
trained in so called condensed matter and biophysics. So I'm not allowed near our astronomy courses. I'm more a physicist. Yeah.
I see. I see. But before we go into Max Planck's life story, could you just explain to our viewers and listeners what his role was in development of physics and quantum physics?
Yes, absolutely. He's at the headwaters. I'll give you one summary physics answer and one sort of very social answer.
Yeah.
And science is a social pursuit. Ultimately, we're a bunch of primates trying to work together. So scientifically, he became obsessed with one bit of physics that no one could explain, but was very compelling. And that is the following. I think I can summarize it. If I take a ball of gaseous hydrogen and I take a ham sandwich, and I take a coin, and I raise those three things to the exact same temperature, let's say over 5,000 degrees in Kelvin, the absolute temperature scale,
Hmm.
same temperature, they will all shine the exact same light, just like the sun, which is largely a ball of hydrogen, of course. But the ham sandwich and the coin would also do the same thing. The universality of that there's something fundamental going on in the way a hot object shines. And this could be like a red hot poker in a fireplace, right? Or
Yeah.
anything that gets hot enough to glow. The physics of that he found very obsessive. Um, and it so happened, this is just historical luck, that he had moved his family to Berlin, taken a new job, just when people were getting obsessed with electric light bulbs. And that is, you heat up a filament with electric current and it glows a lot like, the sun or something, incandescent light. But people didn't understand it and they wanted to build better light bulbs. So there are all these laboratories churning out new data sets
Hmm.
on how hot objects glow. And he had this abundance of data. And by trying to explain that, he stumbled onto, really stubbed his toe on the idea that in the microscopic scale, energy needs to be chunked. It is not a nice continuum. It's in little bitty packets or chunks. And he was
Mm.
discovering, he didn't understand this in 1900, but he was discovering the quantum nature of submicroscopic reality.
Mm.
Now, if you don't mind me going on a little more,
Yeah, I'd love you to do that.
also very important in a social sense, in that he was a chief editor of the leading physics journal at that time, Annalen der Physik.
Mm.
And he was a proponent for some people with really radical new ideas. He was an early admirer of and even protector of young Albert Einstein.
Yeah.
And so when many people were ready to dismiss Einstein's new ideas, Planck was really protecting and supporting him, and eventually created a sort of a wonderful job line for Einstein in Berlin that had very little teaching responsibilities, where he could focus on his work, et cetera. So they became fast friends for a long time. And that's just one kind of famous name. But Planck was helping create an environment in the early 20th century, scientifically in Berlin, that allowed and supported a lot of new thinking, even when he disagreed with a lot of it.
Yeah. Because he was not so happy with some of Einstein's ideas, as I remember it.
That's correct. That's correct. In fact, specifically on these quantum ideas, he thought Einstein was going way too far.
Hmm.
And he only begrudgingly came around to accepting a lot of the new quantum ideas 20 years after his discovery.
Hmm.
He thought his discovery was just some little oddity, and that all the pre existing ideas, the so called classical ideas, could be maintained. That's what he hoped. But his discovery had kind of launched something that grew well beyond his control.
I see. So, in a way, you could say that he discovered Einstein, right? I mean, he saw that he had a potential, and he created a possibility for Einstein to do what he was doing.
Um, I don't think that's an exaggeration. Now,
Mm.
understand my potential bias, because I'm sort of as objective as I can be. I'm a fan of Planck, and I'm fascinated by their friendship. But yes, when Einstein was largely undiscovered, still working on thesis work and writing these things that turned into the theory of special relativity,
Mm.
really upending classical ideas of time and space, very
Yeah.
fundamental things. Surprisingly, to a surprising extent, Max Planck was very open-minded about this, and he wrote one of the first follow-up papers in special relativity that
Hmm.
really helped Einstein get bona fide, if you will, sort of
Uh-huh.
some a stamp of approval from the most respected physics figure at that time.
Mm.
And we can't run the experiment without a parallel Earth, but who knows what would have become of Einstein's career without that kind of support? Because otherwise, there was largely silence and criticism for many of Einstein's radical ideas.
Yeah. I mean, Einstein didn't even get the Nobel Prize for the relativity idea.
Right.
So the Swedish Royal Society of Science didn't really believe in it at that time, I think.
Yes. I shouldn't talk about other books other than my own, but there is a fascinating one. I believe it's called The Politics of Excellence, just about the history of Nobel Prize making, et cetera. But they
Uh-huh.
really, especially at that time, the Nobel Committee wanted to see applications. Um,
Uh-huh.
and you could say that many people thought Planck's own Nobel Prize was somewhat delayed because the committee wasn't sure if there would be applications for quantum science for many years. But yes, Einstein won his Nobel Prize for his work on the photoelectric effect.
Yeah. Yeah,
which now we
exactly.
can see underlies basically solar power collection,
Yeah.
etc.
Uh, but Max Planck was awarded the prize, was it 1918 or 19?
Um, I have not looked back through my own book. Maybe we could cut this part out. But
It,
I think that's right. But he had to. It was delayed. The awarding of the prize and the announcements and Planck even being able to go and receive it were delayed. They had a ceremony with like many years at once after World War One,
yeah,
sort of
that's right.
saying, okay, well, here's the last 3 years of awards that we had to kind of skip during wartime.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's right. And I also know that the actual Nobel Prize ceremony was in June that year, which is the only year. I mean, all other years it's been in December, in
Uh-huh.
Stockholm. But this year it was in June because the Nobel Committee wanted to move it to a warmer period in Sweden, in the cold Sweden. But the royal family had a death. A family member of the royal family died, so the king and queen didn't attend that Nobel ceremony. So it was just a failure to to do it in June. So then they moved it back to December again. Anyway, that's just
Wow.
a side thing.
Fascinating, though. Yeah.
No, but I think it's so fascinating because also, if we go to Max Planck's life, I mean, he outlived all his children, right? The four children died
The
before him, or
the four children by his first wife,
yeah,
Marie. That's right. That's right.
yeah, and yeah, exactly. And his son was actually hanged by the Nazis. What was that about? What had his son done?
Yes, his son Irwin, and I think it's very fair to say is Planck's favorite son. They had many uh, hiking trips together, and we're very close friends actually. But Irwin got involved in the German resistance,
Yeah,
and he was implicated in the plot to kill Hitler with the briefcase bomb,
yeah,
which was almost successful, but not quite. Now, Irwin, from everything I've found, Irwin wasn't involved in the meticulous planning of that event, but he was very involved on more the political side of drafting a post Nazi new constitution for a transfer of power and a new, more democratic German government they hoped
mm,
to found, but was definitely found to be a conspirator
mm,
and arrested by the Gestapo very, very late in the war, of course, and
mm,
was hanged with only a couple of months before the war in Europe was concluded, which is very tragic. So Planck,
yeah.
we see in the book, is writing letters, doing everything he can to try to ward off this execution and pleading for mercy from the regime.
Yeah, and obviously that was not successful. It must, I mean, it's hard to imagine how desperate he must have been when this is about to happen.
Yes.
Was Planck himself, Max Planck himself, sort of politically taking any political stance in any way?
Well, he has definitely been criticized, let's say, by history, and he's a scientist with an asterisk by his name. He, to the best of my knowledge, never joined the Nazi Party, but definitely maintained his positions.
Mm,
If he needed to sign a letter, Heil Hitler, he did so.
mm,
He thought he could do more good from within the system, if you
yeah.
will.
Mm,
But he did have a confrontation, quite a dramatic confrontation, a kind of rare one-on-one audience with Adolf Hitler fairly early when he was worried about seeing people like Einstein leave Germany. And he
okay.
couched it. Maybe one could say, well, this was self-serving, but he couched it as, look, you're really going to hurt German science with your policy on Jewish citizens.
Mm-hmm.
And can't we find a more gentle way to move forward? And Hitler broke into one of his infamous harangues and just went on, screaming at Planck.
Mm-hmm.
And that, interestingly, these sad photos we see of him circa 1933 were taken shortly after this meeting. And I think
Uh-huh.
he knew what was baked in um, for Germany, what was ahead, I think, at that point, and had spoken to colleagues in other countries about that. I think he became very sad about it.
Yeah. I know that he was visiting Sweden late in the war to give a
Yeah.
speech. Yeah, I have that from some other document sources. A Swedish mathematician who wrote his memoirs that actually are never published, but I have the manuscript. And
Ah,
yeah, Planck gave a lecture somewhere in Stockholm, and I don't know when it was exactly, maybe 33, 43 or something like that, 44. But
it was
he's
43. It was 1943.
okay. And he spoke in some way critically about the Nazis, and there was a German delegation in the auditorium I mean listening to his lecture, and they walked out in protest, according to this Swedish mathematician who wrote it in his memoir. That's my only source. But so obviously he was not super careful at that moment, at least.
Yes, and I think he eventually wondered if some of his bold statements, and to be clear, from the best I've been able to reconstruct, and there's an interesting report by a journalist who saw one of these talks
Hmm.
that he gave abroad that did have German sympathetic people in the audience walk out.
Hmm.
That he very clearly, without directly, spoke of how people needed to treat one another and collaborate and not have biases based on people's origins or faith. I mean, he would speak very. It was very clear what he was saying
Hmm.
without directly confronting
Yeah, I see. Yeah.
his government, if you see what I mean. But
Yeah.
he was considered very brave, and he was one of the few people who could get away with it. I suppose
Mm.
it was thought. And but now we wonder if, well, maybe with Irwin's demise, that was in some way related to him not perfectly towing the line for the party. Yeah.
Hmm. By the way, Irvin, how old was Irvin when this happened? Do you know what age he
Uh,
was?
I apologies. I did when I had all this
Okay.
book come together 10 years ago, and
I was
at the
just
moment,
thinking if he
yeah.
maybe was named after Erwin Schrödinger, but that might not be the case.
No, no, I think
No.
that's not the case. And um, Planck wasn't um, always the biggest fan of some of that new quantum thinking when Schrodinger was doing all his work. But that was someone. That's an interesting case because if I'm remembering this correctly, Schrodinger was in line to take over Max Planck's theoretical physics professorship.
Uh-huh.
And this is one of the people who left Germany when they saw the Third Reich come to power and said, Schrodinger said, I don't need any um, part of this. No, I think we're going to I need to dig back into that. Krister, I apologize. I
No,
think
no,
I might have the wrong person in there. So,
no. Okay, never mind. But what? Okay, what did Max Planck not like about the new quantum physics that was emerging in the 20s and 30s?
okay. Yeah, very specifically. And we can restate this because it definitely was Erwin Schrodinger who was going to take over his position
Okay.
and left Nazi Germany. I got very
Mm.
scared. That was confusing many physicists. And
Mm.
Heisenberg definitely stayed. Um, and of course led the bomb effort, etc.
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
so Planck really objected to this probabilistic approach to quantum theory,
Mm,
and for quite a while, he and Einstein had a very similar criticisms. You know, Einstein famously saying God doesn't play dice, and we must
yeah.
be missing something
Mm,
if we think, well, the particle can go to the left 40% of the time and it will go to the right 60% of the time, and there's just a mystery behind that. There's no
mm,
fundamental law behind some of it,
mm,
and that really bothered Planck. But he finally came to see that his discovery, he spoke very eloquently about it, that even his famous constant, Planck's constant,
mm,
is kind of best seen if I teach when I teach this in physics classes. It's Planck's constant and its units and everything perfectly describe a little square in space and time,
mm,
and it literally says we can't shrink this square to see any further precision in space and time. It creates a fundamental barrier
mm,
to the extent to which we can measure and know the universe.
mm.
And he finally accepted that, but it was well into the 1920s, certainly.
So it sounds like he was realist, so to speak, in philosophical terms. He didn't accept the uncertainty in as an ontology matter. It was just an epistemology matter. I mean, we couldn't know the particle's position, but he didn't accept that it didn't have a position. Do I understand you right?
Yes, yes.
Mm,
I think again, when he and Einstein were seeing eye to eye on this, and disagreeing with the young folks who were running ahead with sort of a Niels Bohr
yeah,
approach that embraced this uncertainty, yeah, they were saying, well, your quantum theory is working well. It's explaining experimental data, but you're giving up too early.
yeah,
There is a fundamental truth, and there's still many brilliant theorists who believe this, so-called hidden variable approaches to quantum physics, that
yeah,
there might still be a deeper reality that we haven't quite figured out, and there may indeed be let's say, a position and an exact time for some event. And I think for many years, Planck believed that there was a reality hiding behind
yeah.
what we could see, and Einstein believed that much further into his life than Planck did. Planck did abandon that at some point.
But isn't it clear through Bell's inequality theorem that it can't be any hidden variables?
Yes, I think most people would agree with you at this as of this interview. but but
Yeah.
but there's still a lot of interesting work out there.
Okay, I see.
People
Are are
touring around.
are you into quantum physics yourself in these respects?
Oh, I like to read about it. My work, I like to joke. I'm very much a plumbing wrench, soldering iron physicist by training. I did a lot of lab work before I was starting to write books. So I am not a theoretical physics by trade, but I have loved following it, and I
Mm,
enjoyed my time, let's say, at the Kavli Institute for Theoretical Physics. I was there
mm.
not as a physicist, but as a writer in residence,
Aha,
sort of
okay, I see.
studying what the string theorists and quantum gravity people are up to these days. And I really enjoyed that, but I do not contribute to it myself.
I see, I see. Okay, going back to Max Planck, his both daughters died giving birth, I think. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Uh,
In the very difficult circumstances of World War One, including the winter they called the turnip winter, because there was so little for them to eat. Yes.
uh-huh, okay. And where did this happen? I mean, where did they live?
I don't have that
Mm.
geography mapped in my head at
Oh,
this
okay,
at
I
this moment.
understand. And someone told me that the daughters were married to the same man, but in different time. Is that
Yes,
true?
yes, yes.
Can you tell us about that story a little bit? It's a bit unusual.
Sure, it is unusual, and so the daughters were twins, and um, sort of they had always been close. And when the first daughter passes away during childbirth, her twin starts comforting the husband
Ah,
to some degree,
yeah.
and helping take care of the child, which survived. And
Aha, aha, I see.
there they hit it off.
Mm.
Who, far be it from me to understand love, but I guess if you fall in love with one twin, it might not be too far removed to see one having love
No,
for the other. Yeah.
no. It's a fascinating story and quite cute in a way when you tell it this way.
Yeah, I don't know how cute, and we don't know how cute Max Planck himself found it
No, of
found it
course.
to be that the same husband ended up marrying his other daughter. Yeah,
But then she also died the same way. That's really tragic, of course.
absolutely,
And what
absolutely. No,
happened? What happened with the fourth child?
Carl was actually the first to perish. It's very sad. Of Planck's four children, he was most frustrated with and worried about Carl,
Hmm.
his eldest. Uh, Carl was a wandering soul, if you will, didn't find in school an area of passion or what he might do with his life. Sort of battled with what we would call the blues, and depression wasn't necessarily diagnosed at the time, but really, really struggled with some
Mm.
mental and emotional health. And it's just really hard to get in this mindset. But I think if my book has some value beyond telling stories for the modern times, it's just how much people embrace nationalism
Mm.
in the early 20th century, right? And Max Planck was completely swept up in this,
Uh-huh.
feeling wonderful about German military might, and Karl was swept up into this, and Max Planck thought, oh, finally, my son has found himself, and this is a calling, and he looks great in uniform.
Uh,
But of course, he was killed in the trenches
yeah, yeah.
fairly early in World War One.
But you're saying that Max Planck also was swept away by nationalism at that time.
Yes, I think when he was serving as rector in Berlin, and on the eve of the hostilities starting, just gave a really impassioned speech on the university campus,
Mm.
um, about righting the wrongs against Germany, and we're all united. And there's some just crazy sounding language to us now, like unsheathing a fiery sword of
Mm.
righteousness, and certainly changed his tune as time went on. And he had some friendships in other countries, like Hendrik Lorentz, really helped preach more moderation to him over time, and seeing through not purely German lenses
Mm.
about the conflict and what was going on.
Mm. I see. Um, what what do we know about Max Planck's personality, so to speak? I mean, was he very obsessed by mathematics and physics, or what kind of mind did he have? Was he a social person, or you know
It
what I
was
mean?
Yes, yes, he was a very social person,
Hmm.
um, uh, uh, especially with Marie, his first wife. They had frequent gatherings in their home, and also with his second wife, Marga. Um, but yes, he had a mathematical persuasion.
Mm.
Certainly, he came from that perspective. Was not someone who worked in a laboratory,
Mm.
but loved to look at data from the laboratories, like on this thermal radiation stuff I was
Mm.
mentioning. Um, but he actually early on might have thought he would have a career in music,
Aha.
and he was very accomplished in piano, and was trying his hand at music composition even into college, but decided he just didn't have the kind of creative spark for that kind of work.
Mm.
But it's interesting. He had such an appreciation for artistic endeavors his entire life, that he spoke of uh, a physicist and an artist as having the same starting point of this
Aha.
sort of spark of inspiration, and believing without any evidence really, just saying that the believing that the universe has fundamental truths that one can discover is a leap of faith, according to Planck. And I really sort of love that. That it's not purely rational. When you start a scientific enterprise, you are making a completely illogical leap into assuming that there's some order out there.
Yeah.
In that sense, he saw scientists in that first step as artists, just kind of leaping into the unknown, and having some faith.
That's a very interesting perspective. But wouldn't you say that we today have sort of empirical evidence that there are rational structures in the universe, in the sense that we don't have to do that leap of faith anymore? Or what do you think about that statement?
Oh, so I still believe, I could be very wrong, and unfortunately we'll never quite know. I believe if Planck was alive today, he would still hold on to that. We
Mm,
do have some wonderful theories, especially where quantum field theory has run in a
mm,
hundred years since he finally accepted baby quantum theory in the 1920s,
mhm.
has been incredibly impressive with its ability to describe things we see
Yeah.
in sets of experiments. But um, I think Planck would still say we do have human limitations. We still have large, as you know, unsolved questions in physics
Of
that
course.
look
Yeah.
still irreconcilable. Ironically, between Einstein's main work and the work Planck started,
Yeah.
as these friends parted ways poignantly with the rise of Nazi Germany, their two sets of physics, relativity and quantum theory, remain largely irreconcilable.
Yeah.
So if, and I know many physicists pursuing this boundary and trying to unite these things, the belief that there is a way to reconcile these two different chunks of physics that seem to operate very separately, that is a leap of faith. Even
I see.
why should there be a fundamental unity? So I think people are still taking that leap.
Okay, that's a very good and interesting answer. Do you personally believe that we one day will be able to reconcile, to
Ah,
unite them?
I do. No one's ever asked me that, and my opinion on this doesn't matter a lot.
Well,
But I do. I've seen the people in the trenches, and I think I've even said in writing that we might best see progress in this at the fascinating boundary of a black hole, where you have to have quantum theory and Einstein's general relativity meet head on. They just have to shake hands somewhere in there.
mm,
And there's more and more interesting study about these kinds of objects. And now we can observe them. We'll be taking data
yeah,
on what we observe in black holes. So that's
yeah.
very naively, again, I'm a wrenches and soldering iron and wires physicist. But yes, I think there will be great progress in the years ahead on this problem.
That's wonderful to hear. Finally, before we end, can you tell us a little bit about Max Planck's older years, so to speak? What happened to him? When did he die, first of all?
Yes, he died not long after World War II.
Mm,
So he did survive the war,
mm,
and with another small group of physical scientists was located in Göttingen,
Mm,
one of the largely, compared to other German cities, relatively, I say, unscathed by Allied bombing.
mm,
And they tried to reconstruct what had been the Kaiser Wilhelm um, scientific societies that had been very popular for organizing meetings or whatnot. Um, and he's in his like late 80s at this point, and interesting, the Allied occupiers of Germany said, we're not going to let you name anything after Kaiser Wilhelm anymore. It's a very warlike figure and all this. And so Planck's colleagues started to advance the idea of, well, how about we rename these things the Max Planck Society? It seemed palatable to the Allies. He had never joined the Nazi Party. He had lost a son to Nazi execution late in the war, sort of a sympathetic figure.
mm.
And Planck initially objected, but then this was the transition, and so that rebranding, I don't know how well known that story is, but now all these institutes carry Max Planck's name.
Yeah.
It's sort of a negotiated rebuilding of German science after World War II.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, Max Planck Institute is well known in Sweden.
And
So
so international now, and it's not
yeah,
just physics. All kinds
no,
of Max Planck institutes of social sciences and et cetera, et
yeah,
cetera. Yeah.
yeah. I think the Swedish scientist Svante Pääbo works there. He received the Nobel Prize 2 years ago
Yes, yes,
for
that
the
makes sense.
yeah for the discovery of the Neanderthal gene, DNA sequencing DNA. Yeah.
Right, 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 right.
So Max Planck didn't live to see that happen. I guess he died
Uh,
before.
no, he had agreed to it, and the
Okay, okay.
it was well underway before he passed away. Now, it is reported that in his last year, um, he was not as mentally with it. We don't
Mm-hmm.
have any sort of diagnosis of some sort
Mm,
of dementia, but Lisa Meitner, for one, did get to visit with him and say it was a little sad to see his state. So not long after um, Irwin was killed, it really seemed to be a pretty quick decline.
yeah. But he was
And
old. He was almost 90 years old, I think, when he died.
yes, yes, and one can only imagine. It's very cinematic and horrifying in the book, but late in World War II, he's literally running around from skirmishes
Hmm.
between German forces and Allied forces, um,
Hmm.
sleeping in haystacks and whatnot as he and Marga fled and tried to find safety.
Hmm.
Very
Wow.
difficult for such a person of that age.
Yeah, of course, of course.
Yeah.
Well, this is. I really want to thank you for coming to our podcast, and thank you for writing this wonderful biography. I really enjoyed reading it, I must say. It's published now this spring in Swedish, and I really hope it will meet many readers. Thank you
Oh,
so much.
I'm very happy to have conversed with you, and so happy to have this story out in Swedish, especially with Free Tanka. So thank you so much for your time, Krista.
Thank you.